Hello guys, welcome back to the Eat Like Ruby podcast. I am back in studio today with a solo episode flowing on from the last few weeks. So if you haven't listened to I'd say the last two episodes are sort of going to be on theme with this week's one. If you haven't listened to those, I'd probably advise doing so at some point. I feel like you'll be able to listen to today's episode without listening to those first, but I would advise sort of listening to all three and pairing them all up because it's all just going to flow in nicely together. So those last two episodes we've spoken about fat loss, which is obviously a hot topic, and it's especially a hot topic this time of year or more so in the coming months as we start to come into summer and all of those things. So we spoke a lot about the mindset of a person going into a fat loss phase. We then last week spoke more so about the science and how fat loss is actually achieved. And I think that can be a really informative episode for people who don't know that stuff. So if you're someone who has struggled a lot to achieve fat loss, really ask yourself, like, do I actually know what is required to have a successful fat loss phase? Not just, I need to eat well or I need to exercise, but like, what is actually happening in the body? What is the process? What is the science behind it? I think the more we can learn that and understand that, the more we can actually have a successful fat loss phase because we know what we're doing and we know why. We're not just trying to be good or trying to eat well, but not really understanding how that may or may not be adding up for us or against us. And that's kind of what I want to speak about today. So today I wanted to talk about some common diets or ways of eating that I tend to see, especially with women, and they absolutely could be the same with men, but I predominantly work with women, and we tend to just see the same things. When somebody first comes in to Eat Like Ruby, they've got a lot of the same beliefs. They might have a lot of the same history. They've been through a lot of the same cycles. There's just a few really common standout things. Obviously, as I get into it, we know I love to pull things apart and have my opinion. And there's obviously probably going to be a lot of cons to these things, but there can be pros. And I really want to just point out the pros, the cons, why some things work, how they work. And I think it's a really common thing to adopt a diet or a way of eating, see some initial progress, obviously therefore see some pros, if you will, but then eventually go back to our old ways or lose that progress or whatever. And then we sort of form this habit of like, oh, that diet worked for me. And the thing I love to point out there is if something has worked, we shouldn't have to go back and start it again 6 times a year, every year for the last 10 years. So if you're somebody that is always sort of starting again or going back to, whether it's clean eating or low carb or avoiding sugar or leaving out bread or whatever it might be, everyone will have their different thing. But if you're constantly going back to something in the mindset of like, that worked for me last time, we really want to look and think, well, if that did work, why do we have to go back and do it again and start again? Why did we stop? If something was working so well, why did we stop? If it then undid the progress, did it actually work long term? And if we're then going to go back and start it again, what's going to be different this time? That exact cycle I see with so many people with so many different diets or ways of eating. And that's why I thought today I would pick those common few that I really see and break down what is actually happening in that process. So if you found yourself in that loop, you can start to understand it a little bit more and therefore understand what do I need to do to get out of it. So at the end of last week's episode, I touched on this a little bit in terms of people who will leave out a certain food or restrict a certain food. And really common ones we see here are like bread or pasta or carbs as a whole. So I feel like we've either all been in that process or we've at least been around someone who's been in that process of like, I'm not eating bread, I'm not eating pasta, I'm not eating carbs, whatever their exact thing is. I think we can all relate to that in some way. And like I touched on in last week's episode, when we do this, obviously, super quick summary if you didn't listen to last week. In order to achieve fat loss, we need to be in a calorie deficit. We need to have less calories coming into the body than the body uses every day. So the body then uses its stored calories, aka its stored energy, which is body fat. So I'm not going to go through that again. If you don't understand that, go back and listen to last week's, then come back to here. But what we touched on last week with the whole food restriction thing is people can then remove a food like bread, for example. By doing so, they've also removed anywhere from 100 to 300 calories from their diet, depending on what bread they were eating. It's always going to be different. Therefore, potentially creating that calorie deficit, seeing fat loss progress, but then making that connection in their mind of, I took out bread and I achieved fat loss, I achieved weight loss. Therefore, I cannot eat bread if I want to lose weight. When really, like I said, what's actually happened there is by removing the bread, we've created the energy deficit or the calorie deficit needed to elicit fat loss. So this can be so common, like I said, with bread, pasta, sugar, carbs as a whole. Some people do it with other foods like fat. I feel like that was more so back in the day. People would go low fat, I'm ditching fat, or I'm going low fat, or whatever. But the underlying thing anytime we've removed a food is, have we potentially removed enough calories by removing that food to therefore put ourselves in a calorie deficit and achieve fat loss? Usually what happens here is we see an initial response. If we were eating, let's say we were eating bread and pasta and all these things, and therefore our total calorie intake was around 2,000. I think I used these numbers last week. If we then took out bread and pasta and a few other things, so much so that we removed 500 calories from our diet, we're now eating 1,500 calories. We've gone from 2,000 to 1,500. For a lot of people, that would create quite an effective deficit. So therefore, when we spend a few days and weeks doing that, we start to see weight loss occur. And again, like I said, we form that connection. When I removed all those foods, I achieved weight loss. What we tend to see happen here is a few different scenarios, but a common one is we get the result we want, or we see that movement we want, and then we get to where we want to be. If we didn't have much to lose, or if we've stuck to it for a while and we've lost what we wanted to, we then start to bring those things back in. And usually we haven't learnt to do so in a moderate, enjoyable way. So it is kind of that feast and famine, restriction and binge thing. Like, I've cut this out for ages. I've now brought it back. I don't know how to moderate my intake with these things. So we go quite hard on them. Therefore, our total calorie intake starts to increase, and therefore we start to undo the fat loss. So if we think about fat loss or weight loss needing a calorie deficit in place, obviously fat gain and weight gain needs a calorie surplus in place. If we start to bring in a lot of foods that we have left out for days or weeks or months, our total calorie intake is going to increase. If it does, so much so that we now move into a calorie surplus, it's not that now I'm eating bread, pasta, sugar, whatever, I'm gaining weight. It's now I'm eating a ton more calories. I'm gaining weight. So we really need to understand that it works both ways. The other common thing we see here is if a person does remove all of these things, or any of these things that they've deemed to be bad or wrong or whatever, a really common thing we see is people will take those out. They'll have quite a bland, boring diet. It is a deficit. They start to see some progress, happy days. As they start to work through that, usually maybe after a few weeks, it'll be different from person to person. But at some point, we start to crave things and we start to get a bit bored of our diet without all these foods in it, and it starts to get a little bit bland. A really common thing that happens here is people then start seeking, air quote, health foods, whether it's like healthy, clean, raw recipes or whatever, or the health food aisle at the supermarket, which is honestly a whole nother topic. We should do a whole episode on the health food aisle. But what is really common is that, like I said, our diet is quite bland and boring. We go and start seeking all of these things, and we're like, clean brownies or fucking protein bars or those broccoli chips or veggie chips or whatever. Like, there's so many random things people will bring in. And there's this belief there of like, well, I've removed bread, I've removed pasta, carbs, sugar, whatever it is. These foods that I'm now seeking out are, air quotes, good, they're clean, whatever. If we think back to the numbers, if at one point you were eating 2,000 calories, you took out a bunch of foods, it brought your total intake down to 1,500, you start to see some progress, things are looking good, you then start to get some cravings and you start to seek out these foods. What people need to understand is, no matter how clean, healthy, gluten-free, dairy-free, sugar-free, fat-free, whatever a food will always contain calories to some extent. And the crazy thing is, And this is why I feel like we could do a whole episode on the health food aisle, or maybe a YouTube episode would be good. So many of those foods in that health food aisle, or like a clean raw recipe, still contain really similar calories to the foods we've taken out. So if we took out 500 calories worth of foods and we've then started to seek, like I said, a clean raw brownie, maybe it has 150 calories. We've bought in, like we've found like, oh, a protein bar, this is cool. There's another 150 calories. Like, oh, veggie chips, there's another 150. If we've gone through that whole process and we are getting like snacky and cravings and whatever, and we start to seek out these things and bring them in, we've really gone through a whole cycle where we were on 2,000 calories. We took a bunch of shit out. We went to 1,500. We've started to bring a bunch of shit in that we think is good or clean or whatever, and going to keep working in our favor with this fat loss progress that we're making. But the more that shit starts to creep in, the more it's going to add up, because it still contains calories. And like I said, quite often the same amount as we've just taken out. And over time, we find ourselves back on a 2,000 calorie diet. And then people start thinking like, what the hell happened? Like I was good and like things were moving and everything was working, and now they're not. And it causes a lot of confusion. People get left in that position of like, well, I took this out and it worked, and then like I'm still eating cleaner, I'm eating good, as people say, and now it's slowed down. And then this can lead to a whole nother like all other sort of cycles and things where people start thinking like, my metabolism's shitty, or I need to start training more, or whatever it is. But really the underlying thing there is that we don't understand energy balance. And that's exactly what we talked about in last week's episode. Like, truly, what is energy balance, calorie deficit, all those things, they all mean the same thing. When we don't understand that, we find that we blame certain foods, meals, or diets or ways of eating for our progress, or for slowing down our progress, or whatever. But the underlying thing is always going to be the total energy intake, or the total calorie intake, which, like I said, if we do start to bring in a bunch of air quote healthy things, can still add up to leave us not in a calorie deficit. And that probably leads into another really good point. If somebody isn't in that position, like we'll move on to another way of eating now, but it's such a common way of eating for people to just think, I need to eat good, I need to eat clean, I need to eat healthy, however we word it, in order to achieve fat loss. And we've spoken about this a lot throughout the podcast, but I really want to break it down today because, again, all of the clean, healthy, raw, gluten-free, dairy-free foods in the world are still going to add up and accumulate across the day to a certain calorie intake. And if that calorie intake isn't a deficit for us, doesn't leave us in a calorie deficit, I should say, we're not going to see fat loss. So really the thing there is, no matter how clean or good or healthy we eat, if our total intake pulls us out of a calorie deficit, we're not going to see the result we want. And this can be a really common one where people will then start to think like, my metabolism's shitty, or it's my hormones, or it's something like that. They'll think it's a big external factor. I would say there, if you're someone who thinks that your metabolism or your hormones or something like that is causing you to not be able to achieve fat loss, first of all, go and get that confirmed by a medical professional. Do not let that cock block you from getting a result because you're constantly telling yourself, oh, my metabolism's shitty, or this is shitty, or whatever. You want to know for sure that that is occurring, and then you can work with that instead of just saying, oh, well, it's not working for me because of that, and then not really doing anything about it. So that's the first thing I'll say there, but totally up to you if you want to go and get that checked first. But if you are going to run the story of like, especially like my metabolism is shitty, really ask yourself like, do I actually know what my metabolism is or isn't doing, and what my actual energy intake is, what my actual activity levels are, to really break it down, look at the science, look at the facts, look at the numbers, and actually be able to say if your metabolism is shitty. You need to be able to say, well, this is how much I eat, this is how much I burn, these are my actual numbers, and it's still not working for me, so therefore there must be something happening with my metabolism. if you can't actually lay out the facts of what is occurring with your metabolism, apparently, you shouldn't be running that story. So I feel like that was a bit of a sidestep, but that's a really important thing to look at. And coming back to the sort of typical clean, healthy diet, if we don't understand how calories add up and how food and energy and everything adds up, that can be such a shitty place to be in, because we do really think, well, I am, air quotes, doing everything right. I'm being good. I'm being healthy. I'm saying no to bad foods, whatever it is. But if we don't actually know the numbers and how things are adding up, we can't sort of say like, I should be making this progress or I should be achieving this, because we simply don't know. And one thing I want to look at here, and again, it's probably a little bit of an attack on the health food aisle or whatever, but so often people can really think this, like they are eating well and they're doing all the right things. And one thing I will say here is, if that's you, I don't want to like shame that or whatever, because if you're genuinely trying and you think you're doing all the right things, it's shitty to feel like you're not getting a result. It's shitty to think that you're not getting progress as a result of that. So, and it's a wicked effort in the first place to actually be trying and trying to do all the right things. But this is where it's so important to actually understand and know what the air quote right things are. Otherwise, you will find yourself spinning your wheels and trying and busting your ass, but not having the result you want to show for it. A really perfect example of this, and I've done a few Instagram posts on this over the years, and I'll try and repost them when this episode comes out so we can really see it. So often when we look at someone who is like eating clean or eating well, when we really break down that day, if somebody's having, especially I feel like these days when we see a lot of like clean recipes on the internet or whatever, if someone's having like a big bowl of oats or a smoothie or whatever, and it looks really healthy and, good for you, it could still be like 400 or 500 calories, let's just say, for example. So some sort of typical Fitspo healthy breakfast might be 400 or 500 calories. We might then go and get a coffee for 200 calories, let's say, give or take away coffee. We might get like a protein bar or something from that health food aisle. Another 200 calories, we're now up to 900. You might have like a healthy takeaway salad or whatever. Sometimes they are packed with so many more calories than we think. So if there's 500, we're now up to 1400. If we then hit the health food aisle again for snacks in the afternoon, we might take in another 300 or 400 calories. There's 1800. Let's say we have a typical sort of meat and veg healthy dinner, might be 300 or 400 calories. We're now up to 22. Maybe you've made some raw healthy treat for dessert. That's another 200 calories. You're now up to 2,400 calories. That's quite an air quote good healthy day when we think about it. Nice big clean Fitspo breakfast. All our snacks are from the health food aisle. We've had salad for lunch. We've had a takeaway coffee. We've had a meat and veg dinner. We've had our raw clean dessert, whatever that is. Yet the overall calorie intake very quickly added up to 2,400. 2,400 can be a surplus, deficit, whatever, depending on the individual. But for a lot of females, I'll use myself as a perfect example. I would absolutely not achieve fat loss if I was eating 2,400 calories every day. I do not achieve fat loss when I eat 2,400 calories every day. And the real thing there, and I've said it before and I'll probably say it a million times again, it does not matter how clean or good or healthy that day is. It is still going to add up. So that's where it's so important to understand how those things do add up instead of just seeing them as like black and white, good or bad, because that's where I feel like so many people get stuck thinking like, I am doing everything right and it's not working. And then I'm going to go into sort of one more typical dieting style that I see, and then I feel like they'll all kind of start to tie into each other because there is always going to be common themes, and you might find that you're doing some of these things from one style and some things from another, or maybe you've kind of dabbled in and out, like I was cutting carbs and then I just tried to eat healthy and then I went back to cutting bread, and it's so common to yo-yo back and forth between these things. So everything's probably going to start to tie in like it always does. But one more really common thing we see, and this can even be common in people who are tracking their food or maybe they're starting to understand these things a little bit more, is the sort of low calorie restrictive weeks and the bigger weekends or nights out or whatever it is. I feel like years ago, and this may still be a common thing, I just don't hear it that much, but it used to be really common to be quite restrictive in the week and then have like a cheat meal on the weekend. So I don't know if people are still doing that. Maybe they are or whatever. But The thing we want to point out here, whether you're tracking your calories or whatever, let's just say your weekdays are quite solid, they're quite good, your intake is quite low. Let's say you are actually doing the right things in order to achieve fat loss. You're having an intake that would be really optimal for you to progress towards fat loss throughout the week. Usually we reach a point, whether it is for some people, it's like Tuesday, for some people it's Wednesday, Thursday, super common to hit this point by the weekend where we've started to move away from that and we're eating a little bit more. Sometimes it's a gradual thing that'll happen throughout the back end of the week or into the weekend, or sometimes it's really intentionally like strict up until Saturday, and then Saturday's like a big day of eating. And that's where that sort of cheat meal or cheat day thing used to come in. Our body is not just working in that 24-hour clock of like, well, I hit a deficit Monday, so I will get fat loss as a result on Monday. And then I hit a deficit Tuesday, so I will get fat loss as a result on Tuesday. We need to be consistently doing these things over time and have the body in that phase, in that cycle where it is gradually progressing towards fat loss or gradually progressing towards weight gain. It's the same as like if we went out and just had one big meal right now. We're not just suddenly going to be gaining weight ongoing. It's the accumulation of what we're doing all the time. But the reason I wanted to point that out is what tends to happen here is, like I said, we are actually having that optimal intake during the week to achieve fat loss. If we have either fallen off track or we actually intentionally go off track and have a cheat meal or a cheat day or whatever that is really high in calories, and usually we don't actually know, but just the foods and the way we tend to go on these meals or these days tends to lead to a really high calorie intake. When we step back and look at the week as a whole, the average calorie intake is a lot higher than we think. So let's just say, for example, we'll use the numbers we used before. A person maintains weight on 2,000 calories. They get sufficient fat loss or optimal fat loss on 1,500 or 1,600. So they're actually hitting that 1,500 or 1,600 maybe Monday to Thursday, Monday to Friday, whatever it is. They then have anywhere from 1, 2, or 3 days really going hard on food and having a very high intake. Maybe these days are in the 3,000s, maybe even 4,000 calories. These can add up very quickly. If we think about like going out for dinner and having garlic bread and pizza and dessert and wine, or if we think about going out and having, maybe an entree or a cheese platter or something, and then a burger and chips and then a dessert, like that can add up into the thousands of calories so quickly. And I'm not against that. We all know I'm all for the fun foods, but it's about really understanding how quickly this shit can add up, because in this scenario, if we have hit that 1,500 calorie intake, let's say for 5 days, but then we go and have 2 days like Saturday, Sunday at 4,000 calories. Our total intake for the week, let me do the math so quickly, 1,500 times 5 is 7,500. If we then had 2 days at 4,000, we go to 15,500 calories. I hope all that maths was right. Someone will pull me apart if it wasn't. If our total calorie intake for the week was 15,500 calories, when we divide that by 7, our average intake is 2,200 calories a day. This is one of the biggest things that can cockblock people from actually getting results, because they truly believe, I only eat 1,500 calories and I'm not getting a result. And then even if sometimes that those extra calories creep in and it wasn't intentional, so we don't really want to look at it or we don't really want to admit it. But even if it was intentional, you're just like, you know what, fuck it on the weekends. I have weekends off and I go hard. You have to truly understand how that plays out. Like I said, if we step back and look, the total intake for the week is 15,000, divide it by 7, 2,200. You cannot sit there and say, I only eat 1,500 calories a day, because you do not. And this is one of the biggest things people have to understand. And this even ties in with what I said before, where people can then start truly being like, it's my metabolism, it's this, it's that, whatever. People will genuinely believe, I don't achieve fat loss on 1,500 calories a day, therefore it must be my metabolism. You're not averaging 1,500 calories a day in this scenario. So this is what we really need to look at. There's so many things that may or may not relate to different people in that situation. So like I said, you might be doing it intentionally, you might not be, you might be blaming your metabolism, you might not be. Like it's going to be different for everybody. But anytime we are having big days off or big meals out, or we're gradually going off track or whatever, we have to really look at that and own that and be honest with that before we want to claim something isn't working. And I think that comes back to what I said at the very start of really understanding science and nutrition and calories and all of these things, because I think a lot of people, even in this scenario, like we just said, are like, oh, but I was so good all week, surely I can just go out for tea. And while you absolutely can, and P.S. if you join the fat loss phase, I might actually even teach you how, but while we can absolutely do those things, we can't ignore science. We can't ignore the facts. So it's not as simple. I think people almost get into that entitlement thing, or it's even like that, balance and you only live once. Surely I should just be able to go out for tea. I've said this before. You can go out and get 6 pizzas. I don't care. The cops don't care. No one cares. But we can't confuse, surely I should be able to just go out for a meal, with my body should defy science and still respond the way I want it to when I've gone out and eaten in a different way. And that's the difference between surely I should be able to do it versus, but am I actually okay with what this tangibly means in terms of the science, in terms of the facts, in terms of the way things are going to respond. Whether we track food, whether we don't, whether it's a blowout, whether it's not, whatever, absolutely, like I said, we can have balance, we can go out for meals, all of these things. But we can't play victim and just be like, surely it should still just add up in my favor. If it's not, it's not. And that's the biggest thing. Like, if you are in any of these loops and not achieving the result you want, you don't want to get into that habit of being like, oh, but surely I should be. Because like I said, if you're not, you're not. So let's look at why you're not. Let's stop saying, surely I should be. Please, science, start just tweaking a little bit to work in my favor. If it's not working in your favor, really stop and look at why. And even if we think about all of those things I've just spoken about, like I said, they can start to tie in together. So a person might be eating their optimal intake for a few days, or they might have cut out bread for a few days or whatever, and that's led to their optimal intake. And then we start to even bring in things, like I said, those health food things, or like, oh, just have a bit of this or just have a bit of that. And while we may not have like gone and blown out or had a big meal out or whatever, again, it's those gradual inclusions that accumulate more and more and more. And again, if we then look and are not getting the result that we want, people can again revert back to that, like, oh, but I just had a couple of extra snacks or just had this or whatever. If it is resulting in you not making the progress you want, you've got to look at that and add that up and see, like, why is that happening? So like I said, think about any of those scenarios and certain ones that may or may not be applying to you. And even one more thing we see, and it's probably all just going to keep tying in, but one more thing we see is a person, usually this is people who are tracking their food, but it can still happen when we don't track our food. But let's say you are tracking your food and you're trying to hit 1,600 calories. You know that's a deficit for you, happy days, whatever. You've planned out good days. They add up to 1,600. If you are sticking to that and following through on that, and then going past the pantry or going into the work tea room and having a Tim Tam, and then making your kids' lunches and having a bite, and then making tea and spooning a little bit of peanut butter out of the jar, and then still eating everything from your 1,600 calorie day, you are not eating 1,600 calories a day. You are probably eating 1,900 to 2,000. And again, this can be a really common thing where people will then say, I only eat 600 calories a day. Do not confuse I only eat 600 calories a day with I only track 1,600 calories a day. Big fucking difference. When we look at that, individual things on their own usually aren't going to make or break a diet. Like if we literally have one Tim Tam or one biscuit, it's probably not going to make or break our diet. But if we look at that, it's about 100 calories. If we then, like I said, maybe we have some bites of our kids' lunch when we're making that, maybe there's 100 calories. If we're spooning peanut butter out of the jar, side note, peanut butter is one of those things that people can think, this is so clean, this is so healthy, whatever. It's so fucking high in calories. Peanut butter racks up calories so quickly. If you're ever spooning peanut butter out of the jar, I dare you to put it on the scale, spoon it like you would, work out exactly how much you had, and look at what that leads to in calories. Usually it's going to be very quickly 200, 300, if not 400 plus calories. It racks up so fast. A spoon of peanut butter, especially people heaping a spoon and eating it out of the jar, is like 100 calories. You go 3 spoons, there's 300 calories. So even if we look at that, the one Tim Tam and the one little snack when we're making lunch and then those 3 spoons out of the peanut butter jar, that's very easy to look back and be like, fuck, that's 3 little things. I had such a solid day. Those air quote 3 little things could accumulate to 500 calories and turn a 1,600 calorie day into a 2,100 calorie day. And again, if we think about all the numbers that have been dropping, if we're maintaining weight on 2,000 calories and we know we need to eat 1,600 to achieve fat loss, you're over here eating 2,100, wondering why you're not achieving fat loss. The answer is right there. And this is probably a good place to start wrapping things up. But this, like that scenario can sort of lead people to start asking questions about like, what about cravings or what about hunger or things like that. It's probably a whole nother topic. Like I'm not going to get too much into it today, but when we're in an effective calorie deficit, there will be a level of hunger, because when we think about what is actually happening in a deficit, and again, if you don't really know that or you don't understand it, go back to last week's episode or join the Eat Like Ruby Fat Loss phase. But essentially, the body needs a certain amount of energy or calories every day. We're intentionally not giving that. The body's going to be hungry because your body is like, hey, I want 2,000 calories. Hey, there's only 1,600 here. It's literally looking for that additional 400. And that's what hunger is. When hunger kicks in, that's the body being like, in super simple terms, where's the next meal? Where's the next food? So if we actually want to have a deficit in place, we're going to feel the effects of that. And this is where so many things like food quality, and just as a side note, like I am all for food quality. Anyone in Eat Like Ruby will know that we look at so many things like fruit, veg, whole grains, calcium, protein, fiber. Like our days are built around these things. So please don't think that I'm just over here bashing the clean, healthy foods or whatever. But I want people to know that fat loss does not begin and end with clean, healthy foods. There's another major factor, the actual major factor at play that we need to look at as well when looking to alter body composition or weight loss. But coming back to hunger, there is always going to be that little bit of hunger there. And this is where I'm such an advocate of nutrition education, because we see people then think, okay, cool, well, if the body doesn't, like if I need to create a deficit and give my body less energy than it needs, why would I not just do 1,200 calorie diets? And we've seen that over the years where so many sort of cookie cutter generic things came out for 1,500 calories or 1,200 calories. Everyone's deficit is going to be different. And I've said this in different episodes, even if we think about all the episodes I've done with Shaq, my partner, his deficit is going to be incredibly different to mine. He's 30 to 40 kilos heavier than me. He's 40 centimeters taller than me. Like he's a male. There's so many factors that are going to make up his energy balance compared to mine. What I'm getting at there is we don't want to just fall into that mindset of like, well, I need to eat as little as possible. There's so many reasons why we don't do that. And I feel like I'm probably going to do an episode about that in the next few weeks because there's so much to say there. But this is where it really is important to truly learn about nutrition and nutrition for you as well. And I'm such an advocate of that because what works for one person is going to be a little bit different for another and vice versa. But the more education and understanding you have, the more you can really make those decisions and truly find what works for you, as opposed to just like, well, fuck, I'll eat as little as possible, or I'll cut out bread, or I'll only eat clean. You want to truly be able to break down whatever it is you're doing and say, why am I doing that? Do I actually know how that's going to work, why that's going to work, the pros, the cons? How is my body truly going to respond to what I'm doing? Or is it more that energy of like franticness, desperateness, and then the hope? And I've spoken so much about hope. I never want people to do something with their nutrition and be in that mentality of like, hopefully this works for me. We want to be able to say, I actually know how nutrition works, so I know what to do to make it work for me. So I feel like on that note, that's a really good place to wrap up. I'm going to keep going with this sort of fat loss theme over the next few weeks. Obviously, like I said, the fat loss phase, I don't even know if I said it because I say so much shit everywhere. But the fat loss phase starts at the end of August. So if you are listening to this thinking, oh my God, I need more Ruby in my life, I need to eat like Ruby, then you can join the Eat Like Ruby fat loss phase. But like I always say, regardless of whether people actually come and go from Eat Like Ruby or whatever, I always just want to educate and just provoke different thoughts in people. I think so many people have been stuck in the same cycles or the same mentalities with nutrition for such a long time. And I think the real thing there is to just ask yourself, is it working for you? Like if you are so adamant on your approach or your diet or what it is you should be doing, is it working for you? If it is, amen, sister, you keep doing you. If it's not, simply be open-minded to changing it.